TaskUs On Air presents CX plus U.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to TaskUs On Air. I'm Aleks Bodganovski, Vice President of Technology and Professional Services.
Hi, and I'm Cory Henderson, VP of Client Services. I have responsibility for our high-tech vertical here at TaskUs. We want to welcome you to CX plus U, which we hope today will be the most ridiculously refreshing podcast on all things outsourcing. Today we will talk to you about new normal, new crisis, and what we're most excited about, new opportunity, which we hope will be a tech survival guide.
We'll dive into best practices for riding out the current economic storm that everyone's talking about. We'll look at the core values that companies should consider as they adapt to this new market conditions and what's next for the markets. So, Cory, before we get into the best practices and talking about the current environment as a multi-layered crisis sandwich, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously strong words, right? But I think these days you don't have to look far to see kind of what's going on. It feels like we rolled right out of a pandemic. And one of the after effects of that pandemic, by the way, was it sort of jolted the growth of high growth tech companies, right? There were a lot of companies that saw huge upside either during or right after the pandemic, right? So the whole market sort of goes into this euphoric state. And now, the writing's on the wall, right? The market's sort of catching up to that. And whether we like it or not, the technology sector of the market seems to be, one of the most volatile and hard hit, right? So what you have happening now is a combination of things, but you've got, you've got big tech companies that are having to react to these things, right? So it used to be high growth. It used to be rapid growth. It used to be free money in a lot of cases, right? With lots of venture capital investments and things. And those things are starting to slow. And I think the market is obviously showing that.
So if we just step back to the pandemic, when it first started, everyone was at home. Companies stopped going into offices and were setting up infrastructure to enable employees to work from home. And like you said, everything was booming. All the at-home solutions, the e-commerce platforms were booming. There were so many startups that were coming through and getting all the funding they could ever want. And we just saw a huge surge, and that resulted in hypergrowth. And then, like you said, as the pandemic has slowed down, we're seeing this tech crisis happen. Do you think it's the end of the pandemic that's causing it, or does it have something to do with the current political climate? Like, we've got a war going on. What do you think are the key drivers in the slowdown at the moment?
I mean, this is why we start using phrases like a multi-layered crisis sandwich, right? Because it's sort of a combination of all of those things, I think. The pandemic was bad timing, right? And then you roll right into a war. And then you've got, political unrest in various parts of the world right now. So I think it's, this is where we get into it's a multi-layered crisis sandwich, right?
It does sound like that for sure.
One of the big questions on everyone's mind right now, Aleks, right, which I'll maybe ask you, should big tech brace for a full-blown economic recession, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, the articles, the media is all talking about it. Some big tech has already come out and, instituted hiring freezes and some downsizings as well. So we've all seen that. I think it's always important for big tech or technology companies to ensure that they are setting themselves up for future success, stepping away from just the big tech response, but thinking of all tech, even emerging tech. There's a natural tendency to build a solution in your proximity, around your city. And I think that this pause that's happening, this multi-layered crisis sandwich, is giving businesses an opportunity to take a look at how they're set up and make decisions that are robust and efficient enough to take them into the future. Because I think today's economic climate, whether it's a recession or not, is not going to be as forgiving as the past couple of years have been with respect to spend. I don't think the technology companies that aren't producing any form of ROI are going to have as long a runway as they've had in the past. So it's really important for the tech companies to look at that and to address that now and to set themselves up not only for the short term, but also for the long-term success.
Yeah, I agree. And that's probably a great segue into where we want to spend a lot of our time in this conversation, which is how do tech companies react to this, right? And what are the best practices for riding out this storm? To kind of get the conversation started, what are some thoughts you have on how tech companies can react to the current market conditions in the best way?
There's a number of areas, Cory, where I feel like tech companies can make some good business decisions for their companies. The headlines is what we read: hiring freeze, downsizing, and layoffs. But really, it's a matter of identifying ways in this climate where they can continue to grow and improve their revenue streams and start to produce revenues and grow their revenues from what they have today in the most efficient ways possible. It's a balance of continuing to access revenue and grow those streams whilst maintaining and implementing cost controls. Let me turn that back on you. I mean, what do you think that our tech customers and technology companies around the world could do better?
History can be a teacher here. If you were to go back in the market and look at, say, for example, 2001, 2008, and most recently 2020, you're going to see giant dips in the major indexes like the S&P, the Dow, right? And those are obviously reacting to major events that took place in those years. And every single time, the market has rebounded. This isn't something that lasts forever. In my opinion, we're already on the early edge of seeing how companies have to react to something like this happen, right? When you're losing 30% of your stock price in a couple of days, or even if you're a private company, you've got your investors kind of crawling down your back all the time about the bottom line. Companies have to react, and we've certainly seen that happen so far. And what I'm hoping and what I'm really feeling like is that right now we're going into this phase of where companies can start to actually think about how they're going to react to this over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months. And I think that's where the good things can happen. Certainly there's a playbook, for this kind of thing. And a lot of times that involves cutting costs, right? That's kind of one of the first actions that's taken. And I think, what you'll find resoundingly in the research and people much smarter than you or I are saying is, be very careful about where you cut costs, right? Not that you shouldn't do that, but in general, I think companies have to really look at cutting inefficient parts of their business out while applying extreme focus to areas that they feel can grow and areas that are driving revenue. And sometimes that's not so obvious, right? So using one example, I think if you're a major tech company with large customer success teams, right? Large sales teams, those are organizations that drive revenue into the business. So I think you have to be really careful. Sometimes they could be some of the most expensive areas of your business from a cost standpoint, but they're also driving a lot of your revenue. So, obviously history shows cutting costs across the board is a bad move. I would also take a page out of the book of, some companies going back through time. Again, it's pretty well known that Microsoft, through some of the worst economic times in our history, they spent their time and money acquiring new companies, right? And making investments into their business in the long term. And if you go really look at it, they flipped the script from most of their revenue being product-based, right? Or something tangible that the customer holds, to now, back in, I believe, 2013 or 2014, that model flipped on its head, right? And their revenue now is starting to grow kind of in the consumption model, where customers are, subscription based, or they pay more based on how much they consume, right? The cloud services. And that cost them a lot of money to make that decision, but they also made it right around the time when the economics of it didn't look so good.
As you think about that, and you look at it from a global standpoint, the US is faring quite well against the rest of the world from a currency standpoint. And we're seeing trends as, the current employee has a different attitude to perhaps, an employee that started working 10 or 20 years ago. If the space and the work environment isn't right, they're not staying loyal to their company. And I think that's a consideration as companies set themselves up for success. Some of the companies are finding it difficult to find talent, retain talent, to progress forward, but at the same time are conflicted by these economic downturns and price pressures. But what do you think would be the best strategy for companies to start to address that dilemma?
That's a big question. And I think there's a lot of parallels between employees at these companies and the customers of these companies. Employees are expecting more these days. We all know that. Even compensation packages have gotten extremely competitive. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The second thing is I think a lot of companies are starting to realize that a walk around bar in your office or slides that come down from the ceiling into the basement, all those things are cool, but they cost a lot of money and they don't necessarily retain employees, right? So I think what employees are really looking for, and I think this is especially true of the younger generations, right? To feel part of something bigger. right? Part of something that's honest and has integrity, and they're part of a bigger picture, right? And I'm obviously very generalizing here. And I think that customers' expectations are equally high, right? Customers, they want the product or the service or the subscription to make sense to them, but also they're not always willing to pay buckets of money for this upfront, right? And this is why we see so many tech companies switching to consumption models, subscription models, where maybe it was a bunch of upfront cost in the past. So I think, and again, this is very broad, but I think one of the answers is companies have to be thinking about how to remove friction from the employee experience and also the customer experience.
For sure. And, we're seeing here in the US, and I'm hearing about this a lot on a daily basis in my direct work, the lack of availability of talent or willing employees here, and hearing CEOs come to me and say, hey, can you help me find this tier 2, tier 3 skill set in one of your markets, in one of your geographies? And obviously we're helping them with that. Do you feel like this pivot, the crisis sandwich that we just talked about, that's now following on with this economic downturn, is propelling the global marketplace from a labor force standpoint, where companies that are US based are now more than ever looking globally to augment their talent pool or even fill their talent pool?
Well, yeah, and I think for outsourcing companies like TaskUs, we're often asked the question, how is this market impacting you, and are you feeling the pain too? And I think every company in the world is feeling the pain right now. But what's interesting is for every downside that we have maybe with a client, we have an equally strong upside with another client, right? Because they're looking at smart and healthy ways to not only cut cost, but also, frankly, improve their customer experience in a lot of cases, right? And we're seeing demand for this higher skilled work come in, not just in the United States, but across the world, to your point. One example, which we see many industry bodies recommending, when you're looking at areas to cut costs, well, this is just one example, but if your training costs, especially at a gigantic tech company, are often very high, and sometimes with lackluster results. And so TaskUs, year and a half ago, made a huge investment in that area, right? We're getting more companies asking about learning experience as a service, right? And so I think that's a really healthy way to take friction out of the experience and spend money maybe a bit more wisely. I think sometimes outsourcing has a negative stigma to it, or offshoring and things like that. But what we would tell you is that if you've outsourced before and have had a bad experience, maybe this market forces you to try to look that problem in the face again and have to make that decision again. This day and age of outsourcing in the BPO world, the best companies are able to bring not only oftentimes a lower cost, but a better outcome.
And drive that automation through innovation in the solutions that perhaps the tech companies aren't even thinking about today, because they're so focused on their core business, their core product, or whatever space they're building out as a solution. They're not looking inwards and saying, hey, how can we make this experience for our business customers or our end consumers more efficient and drive stickability with the customers? So as you say, the right partner will help not only find the resources, but also help drive innovation into the customer's success area of their business.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have to remember is one of the benefits is, TaskUs as an example, we work with well over 100 different clients, right, across many different industries and verticals. If you're a business owner, if you own a segment of the company that you work for, oftentimes we see that clients can have tunnel vision. Sometimes they only see what they only see. We can often bring a different perspective. We see that time and time again, where just a different perspective is brought into the partnership, which is where you start to get into the territory of better outcomes. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that aspect of it.
Yeah, for sure. You alluded to this earlier. It takes a couple of years. We'll see the hockey stick turning the other direction and businesses boom again. And hopefully through implementing the right strategies, a lot of these tech companies will make it through these times and come out with a more robust, better structured team and solution than they have or had going in. What do you see as happening next? What do you foresee as 2024, 2025 in the technology space?
Again, if you look back in time, I think we can all rest pretty comfortably that this is a temporary blip, and things will start to turn back up. When I think about this, though, I feel like we have to also address the now. I really do feel that tech companies and every company right now has a responsibility at the leadership level to really approach this in a wise and deliberate way. And I don't know, frankly, if public companies or private companies, who this challenge is going to be greatest for, right? If your stock price is falling, that obviously creates pressure for you. At the same time, if you're private, right, and that money, if you're bootstrapped, it's coming out of your own pocket, or if you've had investments, your investors are going to be very eager for you to watch your bottom line. And in fact, I watched a talk back from 2019, Thomas Law at TSIA. He talked about, if you remember the first Star Wars movie, there's this scene where they're flying around in their X-Wings, right, and the co-pilot is saying, keep on target, right? Keep on target, keep on target. And a few seconds later, a bunch of TIE fighters fly up behind them and blow them out of the sky, right? Because they were so focused on that target. And I think that's what companies have to be really careful of, right? If you're solely focused on the bottom line and the target from month to month or quarter to quarter, that can be a dangerous game to play in this environment, right? I think companies got to let off some of the pressure here. The thing that's going to happen, you asked me, what do you see next? And here's what always happens, right? Technology changes the world that we live in. And so I think that this is an exciting time because this situation is going to force some companies to innovate like they've never innovated before. It's going to force companies to think differently about everything. It's going to make everything a bit more competitive. So I think what's going to happen next is really exciting and really cool.
I see that from an economic standpoint. What we've gone through, a very strong and aggressive boom cycle, call it, attributed to the pandemic or not. And now it's not really a bust cycle. It's kind of like a pause. And I think what's going to happen is a lot of the tech companies that navigating their way through this are going to be more accountable, be them public or private, to the bottom line or the return that investors are going to be seeking from them, just because money's tighter today. And I think as we get out of the next 2 years, the volume of money and funding that's going to go into the sector is probably going to be a little bit more controlled and a little bit more stricter than it has been in the past. I feel that's a good thing, because there were a number of businesses who've been operating and existing and flourishing on a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet that didn't quite make sense. I feel like what we've gone through now it has been something that will address that, and we will come out stronger in this sector as we get out into 2024, 2025 and onwards.
I absolutely agree.
So Cory, we've talked about a number of things, and for our listeners, if we were to distill this down to items that they should focus in on or take away from this discussion, what do you think that would be?
From my perspective, the three major takeaways today are, yes, we have to react to this situation. I think be very careful and take great care in how you react to this situation, right? Now that initial, I think, shock to the system is all but behind us now. It creates an opportunity where companies can react in a healthy way that sets themselves up for 2024 and 2025 and beyond. The second takeaway is, frankly, I think the responsibility, as I said, of leadership to treat people with kindness and understand that this is a temporary thing, right? So when we're giving guidance to the street, or when you're talking to your investors and all those things that come along with a role like that, be a little forgiving. And I would hope, right, that the analyst in the market is also a little bit forgiving, right? Everyone understands the situation. So we always find a way to do that. So I think the takeaway is, keep those things in mind. The third takeaway is, don't be afraid to take risks. I mean, if there's ever a time right now to take risks, that time is right now, in my opinion, right? There's not a lot of bad risk you can take in an environment like this because the results are going to be felt pretty rapidly, whether that was a bad decision or a good decision, right?
For me, companies can use this time to set themselves up for longevity and great success. It's a time of adjusting a few dials, of cost control, and becoming more accountable for their top line and bottom line. And, when it comes to their employees, having an approach that makes sense, that's culturally aligned for them from a return to office or work from home strategy, that is aware of the global marketplace and the opportunities that exist within that to augment or grow their operation, and the opportunities to enter into partnerships and leverage those partners to make themselves better than they are today, all at little to no cost, and often a return or a cost reduction for them. To me, that's one of the key takeaways. Thank you so much to all our listeners for tuning in to this episode of CX Plus You. If you enjoyed this episode, follow us on Spotify to catch the next one. You can also discover more about TaskUs by visiting our website, TaskUs.com, and following us on social channels such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Till then, this is Aleks Bodganovski
and Cory Henderson saying have a ridiculously good day.
Thanks, everyone.